holding up a raspberry. There we go. Okay. So we can see the slides, right? Perfect. I'm seeing thumbs up. Okay, that's good. Let me just minimize this. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining and listening for gathering. I'd like to thank my other co-presenters for sharing their insights. We had a wonderful discussion on the intersections of mental health and especially our roles in it. So hopefully I can continue to expand and explore some critical lenses with regard to that over the course of our presentation today. And I'm gonna kind of walk you through my pronunciation for the title of my talk, but I'll always preface the fact that I am not a fluent language speaker. I was saying before that I babble a little bit like a baby in my language, and that's okay. That's how we learn how to speak. So it's pronounced Kisapniaq, which is dawn. So the idea here, as you'll see throughout some of the illustrations in the slides, is that as we gain further insights into mental health care and different approaches to well-being, that will bring a little bit of illumination for things that have been either shadowed or siloed without a lot of fresh air and light within them. So I want to explore today the evidence of ceremony and mental health care for Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also most importantly, how it influences our well-being and our experiences as human beings overall for everyone, even whether or not we're Indigenous or whether or not we're healthcare providers. Okay, let's see how I can advance these slides. There we go. So like I mentioned, and like was in my bio, my name is Dr. Mikaela Gabriel. I'm Italian and Mi'kmaq of Ukdamguk. Ukdamguk is the original name for what is now known as Newfoundland. And my family comes from the west side of the island. Ukdamguk means the other shore or the land across the water. And growing up, I was always really curious about what the name for the island was as instead of just three words just kind of put together. I always like to have this reflection present because even though I live and work in Ontario, I myself am kind of just visiting my auntie's house. This is not my traditional territory. And I always try and reflect on being a good neighbor and a good guest. So these here you'll see are different training centers where I completed my education. Again, like I mentioned, and in my bio, I'm a clinical and counseling psychologist in practice and also completing research. I did my clinical and academic training from some of Canada's and the world's foremost leading institutions on education. But really crucial to this reflection is that many of these places over the several I think decades that I was enrolled in them is that they taught me how to think, they taught me what to think, and they asked me to critically analyze things. But it was actually only in this lodge here in the corner that really asked me to reflect on who I am as a being outside of the work I do, who I am outside of the lenses that is taught to us, and asked me to reflect and nourish what was inside my heart, not just my brain, and how I can show up in these places outside of the roles that I'm being tasked to do and any letters before or after my name. So on that note, I'd like to reflect on some of the differences between Western and Indigenous perceptions of health and how we understand health, how we understand quote unquote disease, and what that looks like, and how that really shapes our experiences navigating healthcare and exploring kind of what it means for our human experience. So broadly, typically in our colonially based and rooted society, we have very broad metrics of what our society tends to be. And again, we learn about these things through institutions, through our educational centers. Typically, a lot of society is that we're focusing on the individual. It's largely many cultures and the Western point of view for what we see as the horizon of greatest knowledge is individualistic. It's hierarchical. It's very illness focused. So we go to the doctor when something is wrong. And it has a linear causality. So things are very structured and forward of I did this and now I feel bad and now I'm going through that. And that means with regard to health and medical perspectives, it places emphasis only on what the individual does or does not do. It separates the individual from the environment or context. Unfortunately, typically when we go for a checkup or when we're exploring these things, We don't often ask a lot about maybe different aspects of medicine, different aspects of meaning in our lives that might be suffering, larger contexts. I know, unfortunately, many people have heard that when they do go for checkups for any, even especially for mental health reasons, their physician may ask them, are you having enough diet and exercise? And really just explore that as well. But as we know, there's a tremendous amount of other factors that directly contribute to our mental health and well-being. It also very typically has what we call a Cartesian split, which is a division between the mind and the body as separate entities or seemingly separate entities. Now, we know that's not true. There can be a lot of different experiences. And as Sophia brought up, the actual sensation of separation and distinction with regard to certain experiences. But we know these systems are very connected and interconnected. And that's an important thing that isn't often or isn't appropriately prioritized in our understanding of healthcare. As well, typical medical interventions tend to be more disease focused. So again, just focusing on the illness when something is wrong and how we are trying to focus on it. And that means that when it comes to mental health, we see this in the typical kind of CBT model. So we tend to explore the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And this can still take a lot of active work to actually be able to recognize our sensations and our feelings as connected to our behavior. I think a big part in why this sometimes can be a focus of a lot of work is, I think, unfortunately, a lot of the structure of many of our societal engagements that ask us to look maybe outside of ourselves, look at comparison on billboards, on very highly programmed media, things that are always asking for our attention for what we can consume and buy and purchase, and not a lot about how we're able to actually be a being on this planet. And it also, unfortunately, very much silos health systems. And I have here, like, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And we see that because there's often many different types of specialists for many, many different types of systems in the body. And while each of those are very important to have a good in-depth understanding of, the problem is it's very challenging for us to be able to see it, these dimensions of health and well-being holistically and understand how they work in concert together. It also becomes more difficult to understand the impacts of experiences on the whole of the human body unless we have, again, that advanced training, most especially when it comes to experiences of complex, also, of course, acute, but different dimensions and branches of trauma. They have ways of living and impacting multiple systems at once. And that can be very sometimes disorienting and confusing to experience those things and not see how it can and often is related to certain experiences. And that, I think, can unfortunately personalize and problematize our reactions to what's the word? Very challenging experiences, as opposed to really fully appreciating the context that that person is navigating and living in. And then when it comes to, okay, this is our approach to the system, this is how we're going to try and seek health. Typically in many Western clinical perspectives, we then see that what's seen as a positive therapeutic success comes from just symptom reduction, which makes sense. If we're seeking from this Western point of view, we're seeking that there is a problem, how do we fix it? The problem goes away. Okay, that seems like a success. Hopefully we want to match the intervention to the person's belief and structure. Typically from my own clinical training, the idea is that the shorter the sessions, the better. So typically in insurance systems, they'll have, like, they maybe offer like 8 to 10 sessions for people. And that's only really a handful of weeks. There's a prioritization of manualized treatment, which can be helpful if we know that something is effective for, like navigating certain symptoms. But we also notice that there's often a hierarchical approach between practitioner and client. It can mean something to people that someone is a doctor and someone is not, when really we're both supposed to be human beings gathering in a room together. But I'll talk more about that later. So, okay, see, I know there's a lot of Zoom things coming around, so I'm gonna have to move parts of my slides around. Okay, so many of us have seen this. Many of us know that this is familiar. So we typically see this as the medicine wheel, typically a symbol of different approaches to understandings of mental health. Now, of course, like I mentioned, I'm Mi'kmaq. This does not mean that this is a strictly only Mi'kmaq teaching. This does not mean that all these colors and connections are typically associated with all aspects of Indigenous cultures, but it is one that is commonly used and discussed. And I find it a very helpful way of accessing kind of our foot in the door for teaching and reflecting in a holistic way. Each of the different dimensions of the 4 quadrants of the medicine wheel relate to 4 aspects of our health and well-being. And I think many of us that are familiar with the medicine wheel appreciate that and know that. So this may be standard stuff for many of us, but I think it's good to review. Something I also want to point out, though, is that while it just looks like 4, little quarters of almost like a pie, just like we are 3-dimensional beings, this is actually just a 2-dimensional representation of actually 3 and 4-dimensional understandings of health and well-being. The way I really like to think about these things is that each of these so-called quadrants are really actually different 3D spheres of health. Our physical health, our mental health, our emotional health, and our spiritual health all are almost complex and complete worlds that are continuously changing based on the actions we take in our lives, the communities we have around us, the sense of meaning we have in our lives, and how we experience time on this planet. So it's a lot more in-depth and complex when it comes to health. So when we think about that Cartesian split that's often present in many Western healthcare systems, if we're only focusing on the physical and the mental, we're automatically neglecting what we can think of as over 50%, but 2 other worlds of our health and well-being that aren't being met, included, or addressed in our sense of self and balancing. And that's where many Indigenous teachings of health really come from, which is instead of what's wrong, symptoms are seen as an indicator that something is out of balance, and health comes from balance across these different methods and metrics. So again, this is very, very broad, not necessarily pan-Indigenous, but if we're looking at the themes from across many teachings, these are some of the highlights of our understandings of practices and teachings, which are instead of things being individualistic, it is fundamental. Ourselves as beings are relational. We think of health as a holistic dimension, and also instead of that kind of linear causality, things tend to be circular or even like as a spiral. And that one I think can be a little bit tricky to understand or fully really explain. And I've really been hunting for the best metaphor of it. But there's a lot of different factors that can continue to arise in our own lives in broader patterns. But if we're only looking at A to B to C, we can miss some of those, and that can be challenging. So I'll try and explore that a little bit later. But most, especially a lot of Indigenous perceptions of health, and especially mental health, from a large community basis, is focusing on not what's wrong, but what's going well. What are the strengths we have that allow us to meet these challenges? Where are our values that we're able to practice to maybe help bolster our strength and our bravery to be able to navigate these complex experiences on this earth? And that means that health interventions are not only including mental health, but also physical, emotional, and spiritual. As I have my little smudge bowl here, that's something I often, actually always bring in to my clients in sessions, is having a smudge with us, and also exploring how are they navigating their mental health needs? How are they aware of what they may feel as mental health symptoms? How is it being expressed or mirrored in the body? How is it connected or balanced to our environment? There's a lot of different dimensions that we see reflected in the human experience in our external world, such as our relationship to our environment. But when we close ourselves off, that can actually be where we might find some of this quote unquote illness rising. And again, wellness and balance is focused for maintaining health. And again, symptoms are an indicator of imbalance. So it's can seem like a very slim distinction, but it actually ends up changing quite a lot about how we understand who and how we are in the world. And again, so then this means if our appreciation and approach to health is a little bit different, if our perspective of what health actually means is different, then quote unquote clinical interventions for Indigenous healing and reflection is also going to look a little bit different. So therapeutic success, quote unquote, would look a little bit different in terms of just symptom reduction. Instead, it's going to look at how the individual understands their role within the community. Because as I mentioned, things and appreciation for human beings as relational means that it's not just the individual, it's that we're all interconnected, not only in our family units, but how we are connected with one another, whether that's our family community or our geographic community or even our online communities. Humans are amazing at finding connection everywhere. That again, the individual understands their strengths and values, not only what's going wrong, but what are they doing that's really helpful, and what strengths and tools can they draw on to continue balancing and accessing those things and those strengths to cultivate it in their lives. that we're able to develop insight into causality and context of situations and how that contributes to our quote unquote mental health symptoms. So how what we're experiencing is actually part of a larger context of not only our lives, not only the energy of accumulated lived experience, but also where we stand at this point in history in our communities, in colonial settings, how that might contrast with who and how we are, as well as what we now are beginning to wake up to in terms of intergenerational and developmental trauma. So how these things have impacted not only ourselves, but also our parents, how that may have impacted their parenting styles, and so on and so forth across time. So that's kind of where that spiral comes in. There's a lot of different dimensions that it's not just solely ourselves, it's our part of ourselves as part of a matrix that continues to explore. As well as really focusing on cultivating autonomy and coping in navigating stresses, understanding with that insight that we can have different tools and different insights to understanding our reality, and again, the agency of practicing it. Very crucially, that practitioner and the patient are both human beings together on a journey. Now, you'll notice I said patient as opposed to client, and I believe the other one said client. And one of my mentors, who himself is a Buddhist psychologist, really highlighted the importance of the distinction of that, where a client is typically something that's used when you're purchasing a service. And in many ways, mental health care can be a service that's purchased, and that can be helpful and great for filing for insurance. But he advised, and I have to look this up on the etymology dictionary, but he advised that the word for patient, from whichever linguistic root it may be coming from, actually has roots in the word suffering. And he said that's a really important thing to reflect on, because if we're recognizing that another person is suffering, we might be able to recognize that we actually are suffering too. And we're able to join that person in witnessing their human experience and come together with more fundamental person-to-person compassion, as opposed to that hierarchical view. That doesn't mean we give them our suffering. That means we understand and allow it to inform our own compassion and connection with that person. And of course, that we focus on healing, which is, it sometimes can include symptom reduction for sure. But most importantly, it comes with the insight, again, as to the context of why symptoms may have risen at this time in this format, their course, and as well the impact of treatment. So that should they arise again, there's some causality there and some understanding that there's reasons why things happen at this time. So now, again, this is something that I like to provide a little bit of insight to. So many people have heard of sweat lodges. Hopefully many of us, or some of us, have been in one before. Why I like to bring them up is that when we have this kind of different dimension, we can actually see that there's a tremendous amount of holistic healing in this one practice. Now, again, anyone who may have been in a sweat lodge may know that it's a very intensely physical experience, much like many people compare it to saunas, because again, you're in a hot room, there's a lot of water, you have to focus on your breathing. And actually, because of that research from the benefits of saunas on our healthcare, we know that it's tremendously helpful for our regulating our breathing, producing our endorphins, and helping our systems overall. But when we combine it with the ceremony that comes with sweat lodges, which is, connecting with our ancestors, connecting with the people around us, we're able to actually recognize that it has a much more holistic component. And then we start seeing why it becomes all the more important for individuals navigating not only experiences of trauma, but also it's been increasingly connected for substance use and other different types of mental health symptoms and disorders, because it helps to address the person as a whole. It, again, helps with our physical regulation and feeling more in tune. But again, when we're in there and it's very, very warm and hot, we have to focus on strictly our breathing, which now we're appreciating as a mindfulness strategy, which is we have to just focus on our thought. And as we focus our attention, we might be able to find that the quality of our thoughts might become more clearer, because we're shifting our focus and maintaining it on feeling more grounded. That allows us to offer a little bit of emotional balancing with regard to helping to maybe boost our mood, but also to have an alleviation of senses of sometimes anxiety, because again, our attention is focused so solely on the present moment and the drum that is there, and maybe if there's prayers that are being offered, it can be a very transformative experience that offers us a groundedness that we may not always be able to navigate in a society that's pulling our attention away. And as well, there's a tremendous spiritual component that asks us to connect who we are with where we are, who we're with, and who came before us. And that really helps to nourish and think of ourselves just outside of our own lives, but part of a history that's arrived to this moment to hopefully celebrate and understand and ask for healing in this way. So, oh, okay. So my slide arrived at another time, but I think this is important to reflect on, that there's a lot of complex and powerful elegance that arrives with these types of strategies, not strategies, ceremonies that when we think from a Western perspective can actually bring a lot of healing. So many of us have seen this triangle in the top. We recognize this as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think I always like to include this because ever since I learned it, I think it adds a different kind of context and commentary. As much as Maslow is credited for this formulation, he actually spent a number of weeks with the Siksika or Blackfoot tribe in the United States, where they actually had where he was kind of taking their teachings and applying it to a two-dimensional format. Why I think it's really important to highlight the value of ceremonies is that not only are they more complex and diametrically opposed to Western systems that are very prevalent to our healthcare today, but that these indigenous knowledges are advanced and scientific and complex because they've been refined over thousands of years of practice. They're not new. They've been around and continue to practice and bring healing for, again, thousands of years. So not only when we're in that sweat lodge are we practicing something that our ancestors have practiced, that too is a way of helping to connect us with those same ways of knowing that, you know, not only am I doing this now, but this is something my ancestors were able to do. And feeling that line of continuity through that healing can be very powerful, just to remark on. However, as we know, many colonial systems identified these or outlawed them during much of the government of Canada's force of colonization by describing them as barbaric or heathenistic or savage because it didn't align with Euro-Christian values, which I think now we're really appreciating is something that kind of limited us in our own beliefs of what health is. And now we're having to reconsider what health dimensions look like. And more we're actually relying on these views. In truth, a lot of these approaches to mental health are much more layered, and it actually mirrors the complexity of the human experience, as complex as ecosystems and nature are. And I know it's very popular, but I really like to think about those like those videos where people are doing more ecological kind of studies over time about what happens when we see balance restored to nature. Like I think a very popular video going around was when wolves were restored to the Yosemite conservation effort, and they saw how the land transformed when we had what typically is kind of demonized as a predator, but actually it helped to restore balance as needed to the entirety of the ecology of the system. And while we may not necessarily have wolves in ourselves, we do have complex systems that need addressing and need caring for as we tend to different dimensions of ourselves. And that really becomes fleshed out in a different way. That's not just two-dimensional figures like this little triangle here, but actually from Maslow's experience, what he wasn't able to translate was that it wasn't just, you know, this hierarchy of needs of things that we need to fulfill. It was also ourselves with this ancestral connection over time and appreciating the value of our spiritual belonging. So it actually went from a 2D format to, see my little animatic, to more of a 4D format that allowed intersections of light, history, connection, culture, our activities of preparing for the future. And that really transforms the depth of our connection and understanding as human beings, as opposed to human doings, which is what institutions often ask us to do. So oops, sorry. As you notice, my slides like to move around a lot. I try and make them visually entertaining, but it tends to be a little trickier when I have to also navigate my own face on the corner so I can see everyone. Anywho, so when it comes to Indigenous approaches to ceremonies and mental health, like was mentioned, this is a focus of my research, but really is just a method of translating in ways that Western systems can understand why these are so important and why they need to be at the forefront when Indigenous individuals are accessing healthcare. Not included in these slides and this presentation, because I really wanted to focus on counseling, is a tremendous amount of dropout or disconnection from Western-only service providers for Indigenous peoples, because these Western dimensions of healthcare aren't included. they're not usually asked about spiritual practices or emotional health and well-being. It's specifically that siloed practice. And then that means that people only access services in seeking an emergency for emergent care, as opposed to ongoing maintaining care. So again, traditional ceremonies and medicines allow many Indigenous peoples to practice wellness that again was refined over thousands of years. And I think when we use the word spirit or spirituality, we may immediately think of it as necessarily religious. I don't tend to think that way. I think the fact that there's different facets of different religions across the world shows that there's an intrinsic sense of either connection or potential spiritual practices. But really, the way I think about it is that there's a different dimension as opposed to what we do and necessarily how we think, but also cultivating an innate sense of self, an innate sense of value, an interconnection with each other and the world around us that is sometimes, it can feel very intangible, but also adds a sense of, again, that connection with one another, but also a sense of sometimes awe and wonder. And oh, I didn't finish the sentence, so sorry. Don't mind that. But what's interesting is that not only is there this promotion of ceremonies and spiritual practice, but a lot of the elders I've worked with actually describe that a lot of it includes basic mental health care, where when we're exploring and considering these things in a spiritual ceremony, they're asking a lot of questions that a lot of counselors ask. So this one elder described, the thing is, it's basic counseling 101. So what's the problem? How do you see that problem? Whose problem is it? Now, what do we do with that? What do you do with that problem? How do you see the steps of getting past that problem? And here's where the key difference is between sometimes Western clinical practitioners and other approaches to understanding health. This elder described, our job is to go and clear the fog so that they can see that they have the answers inside. And that's a little bit different than when we seek maybe someone else's health and wellness for accessing individual care, as opposed to maybe we might actually have those answers ourselves. And again, with research, both ceremonies such as daily things like smudging or even sweat lodges, as well as community practices like drumming circles and powwows, they help to bolster all aspects of health and well-being, not only from the sweat lodge ceremony kind of circle that I showed you, but a lot of interventions that promote culture as treatment are very helpful, because when we understand that health is holistic, we understand that we need to include these factors in well-being so that we're able to meet all of our needs at once. While we might be focusing on mental health, all these different dimensions are also met. So an example of that is on Monday nights at a community service provider where I do my clinical work. We have a drop-in women's healing circle, and we have dinner together. And that's a very crucial part of our connection for us to be there. It's not just me telling them about this is a coping strategy you can use and tra la la, but we're individuals that are gathered there, and we all need to eat, and we're all able to share that together and be human for a moment together. And that way we know that no matter what's happening for the person in their lives outside of those hours we're together, we're able to ensure their nourishment, because we need healthy physical bodies to continue navigating the world. And unfortunately, for many Indigenous communities, food scarcity is very challenging. So we like to make sure that that's a need that's met, and then we can navigate spiritual and mental health appropriately. But we also see a lot of ceremonies as very instrumental, especially for youth, when they're navigating things like on a daily basis. So one student was describing how both in high school and university, he described, usually when I'm feeling stressed or anxious, I like to smudge myself. And that's just something that I think many of us who have been or are students can appreciate. When you're stressed and anxious, it would be nice to know what exactly we can do in that moment. And while smudging may not take everything away, there is a lot of power in the gentle movement of just very softly bringing something over our minds, over our eyes, over our senses, the way I did earlier. Because I think that gentle movement helps us to slow down to the specifics of this moment, offers a different type of change from sometimes the cycle of our thoughts, and may offer an opportunity for us to take a different kind of breath and maybe find a bit of grounding, which again, when we're in very heightened stress states, can have tremendous value, more than gold. Just having that space to really find a space to breathe can be very powerful. And it's not just in education settings, but also in employment, buffering and stress. So another participant described, it makes me feel much better like that. So if something happens during the day, I don't let it bother me and mess me everything up for school or work. I need those things. They're describing that they need those things to go well. So I really need things to go smooth or smooth through me, as smooth as possible, so I can get stuff down and I can do my work and offer my perspective as best I can. And I think that's really important when we're understanding dimensions of how dangerous urban transitions can be for many people that don't have a social safety net or don't have good supports. Their work and their school is everything they have at that moment to ensure their stability and success. They need to be able to make it to those places. So for this participant in particular to describe that they're able to rely on smudge to help regain that grounding and that perspective becomes very crucial and a very necessary intervention to allow them to be able to show up for what they need to navigate things. Now this is actually going to switch gears a little bit. These perspectives are from individuals that provide support for like outreach and service workers that are providing support for, in particular, Indigenous peoples that were navigating homelessness. So one worker described that when they're actually providing support for individuals, having an elder there or even just offering a smudge was really powerful in providing someone some support that helped to actually de-escalate the health crisis right then and there. So they said, if anything, we always see 100% positive results. So someone can be in a very dark place, something very dramatic has happened, they come to us crying. It just happens that we have an elder that day, they do a smudge, and in the end, they're smiling, they're calm, and they've de-escalated them completely. Now, if it meant that one single smudge bowl could cure every mental health crisis, that would be a power unlike anything I've ever seen. But I think what ultimately so much of them are saying is there's a tremendous amount of intentionality, connection, honoring the person as, again, a being, as an individual outside of maybe their roles or their stressors or maybe even perceived challenges, or if they've been judged as someone who's living on the street in society, that can be very dehumanizing. There's a tremendous amount of power of joining someone in that very honored, sacred way, but where both people are honored and they're honoring each other. And I think that can do a lot for our mental health as well as our total health. So again, another participant described, say someone is having a mental breakdown and we have an elder to come in and smudge them. That can be a coping mechanism just to soothe them, to calm them down. He said, I've seen it done before. And I find that it's good for people, not all people, but some people, to have a traditional medicine. And they also noted, they're like, it's funny because when we bring out the elders with them on outreach sessions, they're like, it seems more non-Aboriginals want to smudge than actual Aboriginals, which is also really interesting. And I think that's neat because I think it kind of hints at the need for involving and including different dimensions of our care, even if this may not be our culture in particular. It's still something we notice that can heal us all. And I think that, or offer an opportunity for healing if we so choose. And I think that's always interesting. As well, again, that was from the outreach perspectives, but also this actually was something from, I believe this was from an elder. So their perspective was just to smell the smoke when people are navigating homelessness makes a really great connection with the earth. It also helps them feel like human beings. A lot of times homeless people act out if they think you're observing them. And if you ask questions, they slam the door and get mad at you. So I don't offer the smudge to each individual. Obviously, if someone's very heightened, that might not be the right approach, and that's okay. But the elder described, I light it up and I hold it. I just hold it in my hands. And when someone comes to talk to me, the smoke touches them and makes them feel real. And that can be a very powerful grounding support. And I know typically in mental health, we might use the word strategy and intervention, and that sounds very, very clinical, very strategic, but what about a different method of approaching our health and well-being? Because we're in a state that can be difficult to tolerate. And this elder continued saying, because smudge to Anishinaabe people is just like drinking water. It's something that we need. I know that those men or individuals get to feel becoming emotional. You can touch on their emotions. They can tell me some nasty thing that happened to them last week, and they go into detail about a lot of things. And as an old person, because I'm older, I don't allow them to penetrate my chi or my soul spirit. I'm listening, and when it goes into my head, it belongs to spirit. It doesn't belong to me. So interestingly, while providing crucial mental health interventions and actual trauma support, just sharing from this elder that not only did the smudge help ground the individual they're sharing with, but it allowed them to have healing for themselves as they held space for that person too. So there's a lot that can happen when we share intentionality and connection with one another. Interesting. So interestingly, while both Western and Indigenous approaches do have their unique strengths, again, like I mentioned, a lot of Indigenous populations are finding it increasingly important to have a hybrid or a culture-esque treatment approach or dynamic. That includes strengths from Western systems and from different teachings and including that and mixing these factors in, which is great. But interestingly, across all these different quotes is a very unique theme that participating in certain types of medicines and certain types of ceremonies is grounding, connecting, and ultimately humanizing. It focuses again on being versus doing, on connection versus separation, and equality and connection versus just a hierarchical structure. So like I mentioned, I have some cute letters before and after my name. People can introduce me as doctor, but all my patients and students, I'm like, you call me Mikaela because that's who I am and that's who I'm here as. The most important aspect of therapeutic change, as we know, is fundamentally the relationship. So ensuring that we're collaborating on cultivating a meaningful relationship and we're respecting each other's worldviews becomes really crucial to substantiating healing and beneficial care. I feel like I might have a time constraint. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Do I have a couple more minutes left?
Maybe 3 minutes more?
Okay, I can slide through it. Okay, so I made some charts just about the different dimensions of how Indigenous ceremony and health can actually offer individual support. So navigating motivation, stress reduction, shame reduction, and cognitive clarity. So not just on an individual level, but also on an interpersonal level, participating in ceremonies with other individuals actually helps to bolster a sense of mentorship and spiritual connection with community. And then also a larger sense of broader community connection, again, to ancestry, teachings, language learning, and normalization of identity, which again is tremendously humanizing. Okay, this is my last slide. So holistic approaches to mental health end up being more complex than just seeing the world through one lens. It asks us to take a bit of an aerial view of our lives, our relationships, the world around us, and most importantly, where we navigate deep connections with these places. When it's done well, we're able to understand complex mental health experiences, not just with difficult symptoms, but also fostering and understanding our inner resiliency, our agency, our autonomy as human beings, how we act in this world, and as well as the gifts and strengths that we're able to practice as well. And this becomes increasingly invaluable for when we've experienced trauma. The idea of refostering and getting a sense of grounding in our own agency in our lives becomes, again, tremendously invaluable and also very healing outside of navigating only the symptoms. And it also helps to challenge the negative perceptions and distortions that can result from, unfortunately, feeling very isolated and unseen by maybe the world around us or maybe by systems that don't quite understand us. I do have some other readings just in case anyone's interested. I can show this out or send this out as well. Just different dimensions and different ways that people have articulated how holistic approaches and holistic theories can help promote not only Indigenous mental health, but also our mental health as a whole. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. I think I almost made it to the final part of the 3 minutes. I may have gone a little bit over, so I apologize, but yay.
No, 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 that's perfect. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So we